Deep inside the Greenland ice sheet, there is a Roman document. It is not written in Latin. It has no author. It has no agenda. It is a thin band of lead sealed into ice that froze one winter at a time, year after year, for 3,000 years. Lead is what you get when you smelt silver out of ore. Silver is what Rome paid its soldiers with, so the lead in that ice is a ledger, an annual record of how much metal the Roman world was pulling out of the ground. No emperor could edit it. No chronicler could lose it. Read it, and it says something the histories do not. Production climbs through the Republic. It surges under the emperors. And then, in the year 165, it stops. It collapses. And it does not recover for more than 500 years. 165. That is 311 years before the date in the textbook. A German historian once catalogued every reason scholars had given for the fall of Rome. He counted 210. Barbarians, Christianity, lead, slavery, taxes, bathing, bureaucracy, tiredness of life. When a death has 210 explanations, it has none. But there is a way to test them, because Rome did not fall. Half of Rome fell. The other half lived on for another 1,000 years with the same coins, the same plagues, the same religion, and the same barbarians on the same rivers. One empire, one disease, two endings. So the question is not what killed Rome. The question is why it only killed the West. Start with the peak. In the middle of the 2nd century, the Roman Empire was the largest single economy the world had ever assembled. One currency ran from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. A farmer in Tunisia could sell oil to a household in Britain. Mass-produced pottery, thrown on a wheel and fired in industrial kilns, turns up on the floors of ordinary houses in every province. Not palaces, ordinary houses. Then, in 165, soldiers returning from a campaign in the East brought something back with them. We call it the Antonine Plague. The description suggests smallpox, though nobody can be certain. It ran through the empire for at least 15 years. It killed in the cities. It killed in the army camps. And it killed in the mining districts of Spain, where the silver came from. This is where the ice stops being a curiosity and becomes evidence. The high emissions of the Roman peak end exactly there, not gradually, not a century later, at the plague. Because a mine is not a machine. A mine is people. Kill enough of them, or scatter them, and the metal stops coming out of the ground. And when the metal stops coming out of the ground, an empire that pays a standing army in silver has a problem it cannot legislate its way around. Rome had two options: find more silver, or put less silver in the coin. It chose the second one, and we can measure to the percentage point how far it went. Under Augustus, the denarius was about 95 to 98% silver. It stayed there more or less for 200 years. That coin was the reason the empire worked. It was trusted from Syria to Scotland. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the emperor on the throne when the plague arrived, the fineness had slipped to around 80%. Under Septimius Severus, it fell below 60. Then Caracalla did something clever, which is usually the warning sign. In the year 215, he introduced a new coin, the Antoninianus. He declared it worth 2 denarii. He put about 1.5 denarii of silver into it. The state paid its soldiers the same number of coins and kept the difference. It worked in the way that always works, for about as long as that always works. By the 250s, the coin was down to roughly 20% silver. Under Valerian and his son Gallienus, it fell to about 5. By 270, it was a base metal token with a thin silver wash on the surface, and the wash came off in your hand. 3 centuries of monetary credibility, gone in 2 generations. Prices did what prices do, and the state, which collected its taxes and the money it had itself destroyed, discovered that its own revenue was worth less every year it took it in. The 3rd century is the part of Roman history nobody makes films about, and it is the part that matters most. Between 235 and 284, the empire ran through roughly 50 emperors and claimants in 50 years. Almost none of them died in bed. The Rhine and the Danube were breached again and again. The Persians captured a Roman emperor alive. Gaul broke away and governed itself. So did Palmyra in the east. For a stretch of years, there were 3 separate Roman states. And in the middle of it came a second pandemic. We know it as the Plague of Cyprian, after the bishop who left a description of it, and it burned through the empire from around 249 into the 260s. Now go back to the ice. The lowest lead emissions in the entire record, a record that runs back nearly 3,000 years, fall inside exactly this window. Not a dip, the floor. Which brings us to something worth stopping on. For 60 years, one of the most popular explanations for the fall of Rome was lead poisoning. Lead pipes, lead cookware, wine sweetened in lead pots, Romans slowly going mad and infertile. It is a wonderful story, and it has been taken apart. The chemistry does not support it. Roman water carried far more lead than spring water, but nowhere near a poisoning dose. The skeletal evidence and the written evidence do not show a population being disabled by it. So the lead did not kill Rome. The lead measured Rome. The most famous false cause in the entire debate turns out to be the most reliable thermometer we have. And what the thermometer says is this: the Roman economy stopped growing in 165. It took a second and deeper blow in the 250s. Then it flatlined. Not because barbarians were at the gates, because the men who dug the silver were dead, and the money they had been paid in was no longer worth digging for. That is 120 years of institutional damage, complete before a single Goth crosses the Danube. And here is the part that ruins the simple version of this story. The empire did not die of it. In 284, a career officer from the Balkans, born to parents of no rank at all, took the throne and did something nobody had managed in half a century. He kept it. He held power for 21 years, and then he did the most un-Roman thing any emperor has ever done. He retired voluntarily and went off to grow vegetables. His name was Diocletian. He saved the Roman Empire. He also handed it a bill that it would spend the next 200 years failing to pay. Diocletian's diagnosis was correct, and it was brutal. The empire was too large for one man to defend and too tempting for one man to hold. So in 293 he divided the job. 2 senior emperors, 2 juniors, 4 courts, 4 field armies, 4 capitals. The city of Rome was not one of them. Notice what he did not do. He did not divide the empire. There was still one Roman state, one body of law, one citizenship. What he divided was the management. That distinction is going to matter enormously in about 150 years, and almost every popular account of this gets it wrong. To make it work, he needed more soldiers. Modern estimates suggest the army roughly doubled. He needed officials to assess and collect, so the civil service multiplied. He needed a tax system that did not depend on a currency nobody believed in anymore, so he built one that counted land and counted heads and took payment in kind. Grain, oil, cloth, recruits. And to stop prices rising, in 301 he issued an edict fixing maximum prices on around 1,200 goods and services across the whole empire. The penalty for exceeding them could be death. It failed completely. Goods vanished from the legal markets and reappeared on illegal ones. By the end of his reign, the edict was, for practical purposes, ignored. What actually fixed the money was not a law, it was a metal. Constantine, who took power a few years later, issued a new gold coin, the solidus, 72 to the Roman pound, honest weight, honest gold. And it worked. It held its value for something like 700 years. It became the reserve currency of the medieval Mediterranean. Stop and register what that means, because it wrecks one of the tidiest stories about Rome. You will hear that inflation destroyed the Roman Empire. The Roman currency crisis was effectively over within a generation. The Western Empire had another 160 years left to run. Whatever killed it, it was not the price of bread in the 3rd century. But the fix had a shape, and the shape is the whole argument. Gold went to the people the state could not afford to lose: soldiers, senior officials, landowners with the leverage to insist on it. Everybody else was left transacting in bronze tokens of drifting value. Taxes were increasingly assessed in gold or taken in goods, which meant that the men who had gold found the system tolerable, and the men who had a field and a mule did not. The rescue worked by making the state's obligations to the powerful reliable, and its obligations to everyone else negotiable. And it locked people in place in order to do it. If the treasury has assessed a farm, it needs that farm worked. So cultivators were legally tied to the land they worked. If it needs bakers and ship owners and mint workers, it makes those trades hereditary. Your father's job became your job, and it became your son's. None of this is decadence. This is the opposite of decadence. This is a state working extremely hard, with real administrative intelligence, to keep an army in the field on a tax base that had stopped growing a century and a half earlier. But a state built like that has one fatal property. It is rigid. It can absorb a shock. It cannot absorb the loss of a province because every province is load-bearing. In 395, the Emperor Theodosius died, and for the last time in history, one man had ruled the whole Roman world. After him, there were 2 courts permanently, one at Constantinople, one in Italy. Again, contemporaries did not believe the empire had broken in half. They thought it had 2 emperors, as it often had. But there were now 2 treasuries, 2 armies, and 2 sets of priorities, and they were not holding equal assets. Look at what each half actually had. The East held Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia. Egypt on its own was one of the richest tax districts on earth. The eastern frontier was long, but it was concentrated, and behind it stood Constantinople, a city that could not be taken by anyone who did not control the sea. The West held Italy, Gaul, Spain, Britain, and North Africa. Britain was marginal. Gaul and Spain were exposed to the Rhine and had been fought over for a generation, which left Africa, the provinces around Carthage, feeding Rome its grain and feeding the treasury its revenue. By the year 400, the Western Empire was a state whose solvency rested on one region. Nobody planned that. Nobody wrote it down as a strategic risk. It was simply how the arithmetic came out after 2 centuries of managing decline. And this is the point where the story is supposed to turn to barbarians at the gates. It does turn to barbarians, but not at the gates. In the autumn of 376, tens of thousands of people arrived on the northern bank of the Danube. They were not a raiding party. They had their families with them and their livestock, and they were asking permission to come in. Behind them, something was pushing. What was pushing them were the Huns. The Goths who arrived on the Danube in 376 were refugees in the strict sense of the word, and the Emperor of the East, Valens, said yes. That decision is usually described as a catastrophic blunder. It was not. It was routine. Rome had been settling defeated and displaced peoples inside its borders for centuries. Refugees became taxpayers. Their sons became soldiers. In a state permanently short of both, tens of thousands of arrivals looked like an asset. What turned an asset into a war was administration. The Roman officers running the crossing, Lupicinus and Maximus, controlled the food, and they saw an opportunity. They sold grain at extortionate prices. Then they sold dog meat. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, a serving soldier himself and no admirer of the Goths, records that starving families were reduced to trading their own children for it. They rebelled. Of course they rebelled. For 2 years the fighting ran through Thrace, and in August 378, Valens marched out to finish it near the city of Adrianople, without waiting for the reinforcements from the west that were already on the road. It was the worst Roman defeat in centuries. Estimates of the dead run from 10,000 to 20,000, roughly two-thirds of the Eastern Field Army. Most of the senior command died with them. So did Valens. His body was never identified. And here is what Rome did next, because the entire 5th century is built on this moment. It did not exterminate the Goths. It could not. In 382, Theodosius made a treaty. The Goths would be settled inside the empire on Roman soil, and they would fight for Rome. But they would fight under their own leaders as a bloc, and they would be paid. That is the arrangement people are gesturing at when they say Rome was defended by barbarians. It is true, and it is also the least interesting way to say it. The Roman army had recruited from beyond the frontier for hundreds of years. What was new in 382 was not the ethnicity of the soldiers, it was the contract. Rome now had, inside its own territory, an armed force that it did not command, could not disband, and whose loyalty renewed only on payment. The empire had converted a military problem into a subscription, which was manageable right up until the payment stopped. Consider the man who has become the face of the fall of Rome, Alaric. He is remembered as the barbarian who sacked the Eternal City. He had also commanded Gothic troops in a Roman army in a Roman civil war on the winning side. What he spent his career demanding was not the destruction of the empire. It was a formal Roman generalship, land for his people, and regular payment. At one point, the figure on the table was 4,000 pounds of gold, and the Senate, under pressure, agreed to pay it. He wanted to be an insider. He was refused again and again by a court that needed him and despised him. Then, in 408, that court executed its own commander-in-chief. Stilicho was the most capable soldier the West had. He was also, on his father's side, a Vandal, and that was enough for his enemies to have him killed for treason. What followed was worse. Across the cities of Italy, Roman soldiers turned on the families of the Federate troops living among them and killed them. Wives, children. The men whose families had just been murdered walked out of the Roman army. Ancient sources put the number as high as 30,000. They went to Alaric. 2 years later, on the 24th of August, 410, Alaric's army came through the walls and sacked Rome for 3 days. The shock across the Mediterranean was total. Jerome, in Bethlehem, wrote that grief had stopped him from working. Augustine began writing a book to answer the accusation that abandoning the old gods had brought this down on them. That book became the City of God, and it shaped Christian thought for 1,000 years. And in strictly practical terms, almost nothing changed. Rome had not been the seat of government for a century. The emperor sat at Ravenna behind marshes, and he stayed there. No province was lost. No army was destroyed. The city was looted, and it recovered, and the Western Empire went on functioning for another 66 years. 410 is the most famous date in this story, and it is very close to meaningless. Which is the trap in this whole subject? The dramatic events are legible, and they are survivable. The fatal ones look like paperwork. The fatal one was still 29 years away. It was not a battle, it was a harbor. In 429, a Vandal king named Guy Zurich ferried his people across the strait from Spain into North Africa. Perhaps 80,000 of them, soldiers and families together. Over the next 10 years, they worked east along the coast, through provinces that Rome could not spare the troops to defend properly, because those troops were committed on the Rhine and in Gaul and against each other. On the 19th of October, 439, Carthage fell. There was barely a fight. Carthage was the second city of the Western Empire. It held the dockyards, the warehouses, the tax registers, and the grain fleet that fed the city of Rome. The provinces behind it were the most productive farmland the West still possessed, and critically, the only major tax base that had not been fought across for 30 years. In 442, the Western government signed a treaty formally recognizing Vandal rule over Africa pro-consulares, Byzacina, and parts of Numidia and Mauritania. Rome had signed away its own revenue. Now do the arithmetic, because everything that follows is just this one sum, repeated. To hold Gaul, you need an army. To pay an army, you need Africa. To retake Africa, you need an army. There is no way out of that loop, and the West spent 30 years failing to find one. The last serious attempt came in 468. East and West combined for one enormous amphibious operation against Carthage. Hundreds of ships, a budget that reportedly swallowed years of imperial revenue. Guy Zurich asked for a truce, used it to prepare fireships, and destroyed the fleet off Cape Bon. That expedition was the West's last liquid asset. When it burned, the possibility of recovery burned with it. The historian Peter Heather argues that if Africa had been recovered in 468, the Western Empire could have survived even without Britain, without northern Gaul, and without much of Spain. That is how much one region was carrying. After 468, Western emperors are appointed and removed by whichever general holds the field army in Italy. They govern Italy and a strip of Gaul. The revenue is gone, so the army is contractors, and the contractors are the government. Which brings us at last to the famous date, and to how little actually happened on it. In 476, a commander of the Federate troops in Italy named Odoacer removed a teenage emperor called Romulus Augustulus, who had held the title for 10 months and had never been recognized in Constantinople anyway. Odoacer did not claim the purple. He sent the imperial regalia east to the Emperor Zeno with a message. The West does not require a separate emperor. He would govern Italy as king in Zeno's name. Meanwhile, the man most contemporaries regarded as the legitimate Western emperor, Julius Nepos, was still alive across the Adriatic in Dalmatia, still recognized by the East, still claiming the title. He was murdered in 480. So the fall of the Roman Empire in the West was a general concluding that one particular administrative office was no longer worth filling, and writing to head office to say so. Nobody announced a fall. Nobody recorded the end of an era. The taxes that could still be collected were still collected. The Senate went on meeting. That date was made to mean something later by historians who needed a line on a page. And the East kept Egypt, its revenue held. When Goths threatened it, it paid them and pointed them west. Same disease, different balance sheet. Now the honest objection. There are two, and they come from opposite directions. The first is Peter Heather's. In the year 400, he argues the empire still worked. Taxes were collected. Armies took the field. The system functioned. What broke it was not internal rot, but an external shock. The Huns arriving at the edge of Europe and driving whole peoples across the Rhine and the Danube. No Huns, no crossing in 406. No 406, no Vandals in Africa. No Africa, no 439. On this reading, Rome was not dying. Rome was pushed. The second comes from Brian Ward Perkins, and it is aimed at the historians who say Rome did not fall at all, that it gently transformed into something new. Go and look at the ground, he says. Wheel-thrown pottery disappears. Tiled roofs stop. Building in stone stops. Literacy collapses. In Britain, the material standard of living drops below what it had been before the Romans ever arrived. Even the cattle gets smaller. That is not a transition. That is a catastrophe. Here is my answer. They are arguing about two different deaths. The Roman state was not murdered. It was bankrupted. It spent 3 centuries losing the capacity to pay for itself. Then it lost the one province that still paid, and after that it simply stopped being worth maintaining. That death has a paper trail, and its real date is 439, not 476. Heather is right that the push came from outside. He is describing the blow. The archive describes why it landed on a body that could no longer absorb one. Roman civilization died separately, and later and far harder than the transformation school will allow. Ward Perkins is right about the potsherds. The people who lost the pottery and the roofs and the reading were not transformed. They were impoverished. And the reason it happened in the West and not in the East is not virtue, or religion, or barbarians, or lead. The East held the richer half of the ledger. The West did not. 210 reasons, and the one that survives the test is the one nobody puts in a title, because it is not dramatic, it is accounting. Empires do not fall, they stop adding up.